There aren't a lot of countries that have went from a success story to a tragic failure over the span of 100 years. But Argentina is one of them. This chart, showing Argentina's global ranking in GDP per capita, shows it all. In the early 1900s, the country was one of the richest in the world, reaching the top 10 over multiple years. At the time, it had a level of wealth similar to many European countries. This was because the country experienced an economic boom, leading from 1860 all the way to 1930. Its capital city, Buenos Aires, got quite the reputation internationally, as it was called the Paris of South America. Argentina was widely believed to become a powerful ex-colony just like the United States. It had everything in its favor: fertile lands, access to the world's oceans, and growing demographics. But boy, oh boy, did that turn out differently. Right now, Argentina ranks 65th globally when it comes to GDP per capita on purchasing power parity. Its GDP per capita ranking has been on a downward trend throughout the last century. Economic growth stalled, and Argentina's economy became one of the most volatile in the world. The Argentinian government has already defaulted on its debts 3 times in the 21st century, and the country has experienced extreme booms and busts. In 2023, Argentina's inflation rate reached 143%, the 4th highest figure globally. This would be a remarkable figure in most countries, but in Argentina, it's nothing new. According to the famous quote by economist Simon Kuznets, there are 4 kinds of economies: developed, developing, Argentina, and Japan. Together with Japan, Argentina's economic history makes just no sense. Instead of maintaining its position as a highly developed country, the country fell back into mediocrity. But the question is, why? In this video, we'll uncover the reasons why Argentina failed as a country. And as the country radically changed its course after the last election, we'll also go over Argentina's potential future. First of all, we have to look at what happened in the 20th century that caused Argentina's demise. For a bit of context, Argentina was an ex-colony that declared its independence just like the United States. For centuries, it was part of the huge Spanish territories in South America. The Spanish colonizers conquered the land from the indigenous tribes that lived there. When the Peninsular War began in 1807 back in Europe, Spanish rule weakened. Napoleon invaded Spain and Portugal and overthrew the Spanish King Ferdinand VII to install his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. The chaos that followed gave the independence forces in Argentina the opportunity to take control. In 1816, the independence of Argentina was formally declared. Later, the Argentinian government established a modern constitution in 1853, which was closely inspired by the United States model. It also began to promote immigration from Europe, accepting millions of immigrants from countries like Italy, Spain, and France. Poor European families had to decide whether to go to the US or Argentina, choosing between the American dream and the Argentinian dream. Because of this inflow, Argentina's population increased from 500,000 at the time of its foundation to about 5 million in 1900. To get even more land to house these newcomers, the country started to expand its frontiers at the cost of the indigenous peoples. This was mostly southward into the Patagonia region. All of this probably sounds pretty familiar because, the US did the same thing. But there was one key difference between Argentina and the United States. Argentina was hugely dependent on its agricultural sector, which laid the foundation for Argentina's economic success. Starting in 1830, the country began to supply goods like wheat, corn, and beef to European and American export markets. This was because Argentina had incredibly fertile lands, mainly in the Pampas region in the northeast. As you can see on this chart, Argentina quickly became a super exporter. This caused the country's economy to grow 15-fold. The rich landowners, called the estancieros, benefited from this because they owned vast estates in the country. And the workers also reaped the rewards, as real wages reached similar levels to Britain. But there was one problem: the lack of industrialization. Because the country was so successful with its agricultural industry, it didn't develop an industrial base like Britain, Germany, or the United States. This was one of the reasons why Argentinian growth stalled throughout the 20th century. After the world industrialized, Argentina's agricultural sector just wasn't as valuable anymore. But this isn't the biggest reason for Argentina's decline. The root cause is the political instability that the country experienced throughout the 20th century. But before jumping into that, let's talk about why we feel miserable the morning after drinking. Trust me, if you've ever wondered why we don't have a scientific solution for this, you're gonna want to hear this. We all have busy lives these days, and we can't really afford to waste a day stuck on the couch because of a few drinks the night before. Today's sponsor, ZBiotics, is the answer we've all been looking for. ZBiotics Pre-Alcohol Probiotic is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to help you feel better the morning after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, and not dehydration, that is to blame for your rough next day. ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and then you'll feel your best tomorrow. Every time I have a ZBiotics before drinking, it makes such a difference the next day. Even after drinks the night before, I know I'll be able to wake up and, edit these videos or write another script. It was a good normal day of work today because I planned ahead and took ZBiotics. It is definitely worth it. One bottle of ZBiotics is equal to the cost of a beer, but really nothing beats the price of a fresh morning. Go to zbiotics.com/businessbasics or scan the QR code on the screen right now to get 15% off your first order when you use Business Basics at checkout. You can also sign up for a subscription using my code, so you can stay prepared no matter the time or occasion. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee. So if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Since its founding, conservative parties with backing from landowners had been in charge. But with the Radical Civic Union Party taking control in 1916, Argentina shifted towards populism. This was because of tensions between the working class and the landowners, who were drifting apart. Mainly in Buenos Aires, there was a huge group of people that weren't happy with the state of the country. This chart shows that the city's population was growing rapidly at the time. All of those people needed jobs, but Argentina lacked the industry to provide them. When the global economy went downhill during 1929 after the Wall Street crash, it was the last straw. Argentina's GDP fell by a fourth, and total exports dropped from $1.53 billion to $561 million. This economic shock was temporary, but the political shockwaves had lasting effects. Soon after, military strongmen took control of the country with a coup in 1930. These generals thought that military rule was necessary to provide political stability. This marked the beginning of what would later be known as the infamous decade. There was electoral fraud and heavy crackdowns on political opposition, making the country unstable and risky to do business with. The government became heavily corrupt, and it held an ineffective economic policy. With the Roca-Runciman Treaty, the military leaders secured beef exports with Britain, but the deal was mainly benefiting the British, who began to have a large say in Argentina's economy. British companies had a favored position in Argentina, as they owned the country's railways and a lot of its meatpacking facilities. Britain imposed high import tariffs on Argentinian goods, but Argentina was forced to reduce its tariffs on 350 British goods. All in all, this military government failed to improve economic development and gave huge concessions to the British. After the infamous decade, things didn't really get a whole lot better. In 1943, yet another group of military leaders took control of the country in a coup d'etat. This was because there was widespread discontent with the corrupt government and its domestic and foreign policy. The military leaders under the Unified Officers Group thought that the government was influenced too much by the elites and foreign powers. These ideas were widespread in the shantytowns in Buenos Aires, which had grown massively after the 1929 economic crash. The city's population more than doubled in 25 years. Soon, General Juan Perón gained massive popularity amongst the United Officers Group. He took control over the country in 1946 with a large supporter base. But his rule didn't improve the country's political situation. He started his own populist theory called peronism, which called for the persecution of his opposition and a centralized economic policy. Perón isolated Argentina's economy even further, right at the time when the global economy was booming after the Second World War. With the Marshall Plan, the United States opened up international trade at a scale unseen before. But Argentina closed its doors to foreign trade and investment with a strategy called import substitution. By making foreign imports unattractive because of high import tariffs, Perón tried to boost Argentina's domestic industries. Although this had positive effects in the short term, it made Argentina even less competitive in the long term. Basically, Argentina's own companies didn't need to keep up with others and innovate. This is just the beginning of all the short-term economic decisions that would plague the country for decades to come. Later, Perón's government introduced even more questionable economic policies. He encouraged huge government spending to fund social welfare programs and to redistribute wealth. This made him very popular, but the downsides soon showed. From 1948 to 1950, the peso lost about 70% of its value and inflation peaked at 50%. For the most part, this was caused by Perón's money printing, a strategy known as inflationary financing. He also encouraged state intervention in the economy. In 1947, for example, he set a decree for the prices on restaurant menus. Similarly, Perón created an institution called the IAPI to control foreign trade. As you can imagine, these policies made it hard to do business in the country. Now, Argentina's economy didn't completely crash during Perón's rule, but it did start to lag behind. This was made worse by the political instability during the 1950s and the 1960s. In 1955, Perón lost his power because of, you guessed it, a military coup. Yes, Argentina's military leaders have built themselves quite the reputation. Perón's party was outlawed by the generals, and he was put into exile. The following 10 years brought about absolute chaos for the country. Various radical political groups wanted to gain control over Argentina, with the banned Peronist movement, Radical Civic Union, fascists, and communists all vying for power. Factions of the country's military started to fight each other in 1962 because of a dispute between hardline anti-Perón generals and others. Amidst this chaos, General Juan Carlos Onganía took control with a coup d'etat in 1966, called the Argentine Revolution. He established an authoritarian regime that ruled over the country until 1973. Needless to say, Argentina didn't take part in the golden age of capitalism that the rest of the world had during this period. Political instability made Argentina unattractive to invest in or to build economic relations with. Because the authoritarian regime was unsuccessful, the population began to revolt against it. Left-wing radicals went as far as to establish urban guerrilla warfare groups. This forced the military government to lift the ban on Peronism and to hold elections once again. In 1973, Perón returned from his exile and began his third term as president. But the country was already too far gone to have any form of stability. Even among Perón's supporters, there were various right and left-wing factions that were extremely divided. When Perón returned to Buenos Aires, fighting broke out between 3.5 million people gathered at the airport. Far-right snipers opened fire at left-wing supporters. During his government, the fascist AAA organization continued to hunt down hundreds of communist sympathizers. Perón tried to put the country back together, but he died in 1974. His wife, Isabel Perón, took over his rule. But she couldn't fix the country's problems. After the international oil crisis in 1973, the economic situation in Argentina went south. Along with bad economic policy, this led to hyperinflation. At the beginning of 1976, the annual inflation rate reached a mind-boggling 600%. This led to yet another group of generals to take control over the country via a 1976 coup d'etat. The following military junta, called the National Reorganization Process, became one of the most infamous dictatorships in the country's history. State forces, along with the fascist AAA, hunted down 30,000 people who opposed the regime. This period of state terrorism was called the Dirty War. But because of the continual economic decline of Argentina, the regime was losing support. Foreign debt had grown to $45 billion, real wages lost 36% of their purchasing power, and unemployment was at the highest level seen since the Great Depression, with 18%. In an attempt to gain backing from the country's nationalists, the junta started a conflict with Britain. It tried to take over the Falkland Islands, which proved unsuccessful after 10 weeks of fighting. The junta lost its political support, and it was forced to restore democracy in 1983. The next president, Raúl Alfonsín, managed to reduce the military's power and to cut back on corruption. But even as the political situation got less violent and corrupt, the country headed towards total economic collapse. He was unsuccessful partially because of years of economic mismanagement by the junta. Many of the public enterprises left behind by the previous government were running at huge deficits. To keep these public enterprises alive, President Alfonsín printed huge amounts of money, also known as inflationary financing. As a result, inflation got into the hundreds of percents. The military junta also weakened Argentina's competitiveness, resulting in collapsing currency exchange rates. President Alfonsín replaced the currency 2 times to devalue it, with the Argentina peso and the Argentine austral. But this was unsuccessful. The enormous debts that the military government left behind proved to be the last straw. Annual interest charges were $5 billion, which Alfonsín couldn't afford. When he lost his financial lifeline from the IMF in 1988, things got even worse. The inflation rate reached 5,000% in 1989, and there was a widespread food shortage. It was so bad that supermarkets didn't update price tags anymore, but read the prices through the intercom. Soon, massive riots emerged as people looted the supermarkets for food. After this disaster, Carlos Menem was elected as president in 1989. He called himself a peronist, but his economic policy was nothing like Perón's. He privatized almost every public enterprise except for a few banks. Argentina was also finally reopened to international trade, but it was already too late. From 1975 to 1990, real wages had fallen by 20%. Prices from 1975 to 1991 had increased 20 billion times due to hyperinflation. In the 1990s, Argentina's industry was at the same level as in 1940. Many of Argentina's businesses were unable to compete internationally, and the country had a trade deficit of $22 billion between 92 and 99. This was made even worse when President Menem pegged the peso to the dollar by law. He determined how many dollars you would get for 1 peso, which gave the peso a lot of stability at first. The government hoped that the convertibility would put an end to the hyperinflation. But soon after, this led to currency overvaluation. The peso was worth more than it would be in free market conditions. Because Argentina's currency was overvalued, it was even harder to compete internationally. Businesses needed to lower their prices, resulting in falling wages and rising unemployment. In order to not completely crash the economy, Menem started to increase Argentina's debts to provide relief. This was only a prelude of what was about to come. Soon followed the worst financial crisis in the country's history. In 1999, Fernando de la Rúa was elected president. By this time, Argentina's economy had already entered a recession. But the new president didn't want to abandon the peso's peg to the dollar, because that would send shockwaves throughout the economy. However, the dollar appreciated, making the peso even more overvalued. The US dollar index was on the rise from the middle of the 1990s to the early 2000s. This only worsened the recession. Another pressure on de la Rúa's administration was Argentina's huge foreign debt, which had exceeded 50% of GDP. He was forced by the International Monetary Fund to cut government expenses because he wouldn't get any loans otherwise. One of the measures was that all civil servants received pay cuts. Because government spending was slashed, unemployment rose to 20%. Soon, the public lost their confidence in the government, leading them to withdraw large amounts of US dollars from their bank accounts. Cash in US dollars was one of the few things that people still trusted. In November of 2001, this phenomenon caused a full-on bank run. This was a huge problem. If everyone withdrew from their bank accounts, the banks wouldn't have enough money to meet that demand. This is the case for banks in general, as banks hold a large portion of their assets in loans. But this was especially the case with the peso-dollar convertibility. there was a risk that the banks would run out of dollars to convert pesos into. So, in December of 2001, President de la Rúa made a law saying that people could only withdraw 250 pesos a week. This was to prevent a total bank collapse. But the Argentine population, which was already angry because of the recession, they didn't like this move. On the 19th of December 2001, enormous riots broke out in Buenos Aires and other major cities. Some people began to loot stores, destroy property, and fight with the police. Others took to the streets in protest. President de la Rúa declared a national state of siege, but the riots didn't stop until his resignation on the 20th of December. In total, 36 protesters had died as a result of the clashes with the police. To make it even worse, Argentina defaulted on $132 billion of its public debt by the end of the year. This was the world's largest ever government default. By this time, the Argentine Great Depression had begun in full swing. The country had 5 presidents in just 2 weeks. In 2002, the new president, Eduardo Duhalde, finally abandoned the peso-dollar convertibility. Long-term, this would make the economy much more stable, but the immediate effects were a lot less exciting. People's dollar deposits were forcibly exchanged for pesos at a rate of 1.4 pesos per US dollar. Soon after, the dollar-peso exchange rate rose to 4 pesos per dollar. So, Argentinians with dollar savings effectively lost 65% of their savings value. On top of that, the end of the fixed exchange rate resulted in massive inflation. The peso lost a lot of its value, meaning that prices rose. The accumulated inflation was about 80%. Combined with the loss in savings, this resulted in a huge decline in living standards. President Duhalde was also criticized because this policy favored the government and private enterprises. Debt in US dollars was exchanged to pesos on a 1-to-1 basis. When the exchange rate fell to $1 per 4 pesos, this meant that the value of the debts was slashed by 75%. Basically, this saved the government and businessmen who held US dollar debts. By the end of the Depression in 2002, real GDP had fallen by 28%. Unemployment was at 21%, and 57.5% of the population lived below the poverty line. The country that started the 20th century as one of the richest in the world began the 21st century in shambles. 300,000 people left Argentina, many of them descendants of European immigrants. Many questioned if the country would ever recover from this economic disaster. Things began to improve when Néstor Kirchner took office in 2003. Under his government, Argentina's GDP grew 8% a year, and 11 million people were lifted out of poverty. This was mostly because of the devalued peso, which made Argentina more competitive for exports. But a post-crisis recovery is much easier to achieve than long-term growth. Ultimately, Argentina wound up having the same problems as before. With his left-wing populist ideology called Kirchnerism, Kirchner still pushed centralized control over the economy. He nationalized various companies and imposed price controls. His government also spent 25% of GDP, financed by large import and export taxes. This huge taxation slowed down economic growth, and the government spending pushed inflation above 20%. When Kirchner's wife, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, took over the presidency in 2007, the economy began to overheat and inflation was rampant. The government lied about the official inflation numbers and threatened independent economists who published their own data. Private researchers estimated inflation to be at 39.9% in 2014. People once again wanted to trade their pesos for dollars, because that currency was much more stable. In turn, the government once again limited access to dollars with capital controls. When Argentina was forced to repay its debts from 2001, it defaulted on its debts once again. In this deteriorating environment, Mauricio Macri led the country from 2016 to 2019. He lifted the dollar exchange restrictions, leading to a peso devaluation of 30%. Inflation reached 41.7% in 2016, and unemployment exceeded 10%. When Alberto Fernandez took over in 2019, things got even worse. Annual inflation was 53.8% in 2019, and it surpassed 100% in 2023. The lockdowns during COVID had terrible effects on Argentina's economy, with GDP shrinking by 9.9% in 2020. Like many other countries, Argentina handed out huge stimulus checks, which led to inflation and rising government debts. By the end of 2020, the government's debt reached 102.8% of GDP. As a result, the government defaulted on its debts, marking the third default in 20 years. At the end of the Fernandez presidency, 40.1% of Argentinians were living below the poverty line. In short, the problems stemming from the 2001 disaster never fully went away. Currency-wise, the last 15 years had been disastrous, where 1 peso was worth about $0.3 or about 30 cents. In 2009, it was at $0.001, which is about a tenth of a penny. Argentina's GDP per capita has grown way slower than its South American neighbors in recent times. So, obviously, something went very wrong during the last 100 years in Argentina. The country fell from 80% of America's GDP per capita in 1910 to 30% now. Looking at the last century, one thing becomes clear. The country had a terrible government policy. Many presidents wanted centralized economic planning and intervened in the economy. One of the worst moves was the import substitution, which meant that Argentina didn't take part in the global economy. Domestic industries were kept alive by a lifeline from the government, which was a recipe for disaster. When the government failed because of currency issues or a debt crisis, this ultimately meant that all of these industries collapsed. And import substitution also caused a lack of internationally competitive industries, which still hurts Argentina to this day. Agricultural products such as soybeans, wheat, corn, and meat still make up the majority of the country's exports. So the country has failed to move up the value chain. This is the reason for only 30% of Argentina's GDP coming from international trade, as compared to the global average of 52%. And government, policy-wise, there was also no consistency to speak of. In the 20th century, more generals were running the country than civilians, with a ratio of 14 to 11. Frequent coups d'etats made the country very unstable, making it hard to have sustainable economic growth. Foreign investors began to lose trust in the country, even when it was a popular investment destination before. This was because things like import tariffs, price controls, and currency markets were very unpredictable. And the mentality of the government also didn't help. Every new leader promised to solve the economic problems caused by the last one, but they often used short-term tools like money printing or foreign debt lending. Inflationary financing led to periods of hyperinflation, and the Argentine government defaulted on its debt 9 times in its history. This caused huge booms and busts in Argentina's economy, as you can see on this GDP growth chart. Every 2 to 4 years or so, the country goes from near double-digit growth to deep recessions. These short-lived and extreme cycles killed Argentina's businesses and destroyed economic opportunities. Another reason for the economic failure is that the whole continent of South America lagged behind. North America makes up 30.2% of global GDP, but South America only 3.9%. And this gap isn't logical per se. Population-wise, North America has about 596 million, and South America has about 434 million. 300 years ago, the economic development in both continents wasn't hugely different. But over time, the South began to lag behind in industrialization and economic development. This was largely because of the same reasons as in Argentina, with widespread political instability and a focus on the agricultural industry. And over the last 30 or so years, globalization has made things even worse. The continent began to get plagued by a phenomenon called premature de-industrialization. The percentage that manufacturing makes up in GDP is actually falling in South America, even before it has properly industrialized. Because South America isn't able to compete with manufacturing in various Asian countries, it's struggling to grow its domestic industries. As a result, the continent is doomed to stay in low-end industries like mining, agriculture, and raw materials. This has spillover effects for Argentina because of a lack of regional trade and development. While neighboring countries fail to develop economically, there aren't a lot of trade opportunities in the first place. We can see this in the statistics. In the European Union, 55% of all trade is within the region. In North America, regional trade makes up 38%. But South America only has 15% of its trade within the region. And it's not that the continent hasn't been trying to promote regional development. With the Mercosur trade bloc, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Venezuela tried to establish a regional trade network. But this wasn't successful, because there was a lack of infrastructure. 60% of the continent's roads are unpaved, and Latin America spends extremely little on infrastructure investments. The only region in the world that invests less is sub-Saharan Africa. Last year, a new leader took over Argentina's government. His radical ideas have earned him the nickname El Loco, or the Madman. He's a libertarian and a strong advocate of the free market and capitalism. Javier Milei wants to put the country out of its century-long demise by drastically reducing the government's role. He's very anti-establishment because he believes that the political class is the main reason for Argentina's demise. The president wants to cut the amount of government ministries in half, from 18 to 9. He also plans to reduce the number of state employees by a third. Because of this chainsaw policy, Milei actually carried a chainsaw while campaigning. The Justicialist Party, a descendant of the Peronist ideology, is Milei's main enemy. This party, although it has many different factions, has been in power for the majority of the last 40 years. Milei disagrees with Justicialist policies, mainly on the economic side of things. To radically change Argentina's economy, Milei wants to implement a shock therapy plan. For example, he devalued the peso by more than 50% against the dollar. This is more in line with the actual market value of the currency. The plan also includes cutting energy and transportation subsidies, of which the energy subsidies alone cost the state $12 billion in 2023. Some of the ideas will be harder to implement, like dollarizing the economy, abolishing the central bank, and privatizing state-owned companies. If Milei manages to achieve this, it would make the state less powerful and give the free market more room. This economic plan is very different from what other presidents have done in the past. Many chose short-term solutions for the economy that have terrible long-term effects. The last president imposed capital controls in order to artificially keep the peso's value high. The shock therapy plan is exactly the opposite, according to President Milei. He said that in the short term, the situation will worsen, but soon we will see the fruits of our effort, having created the base for solid and sustainable growth. Cutting state subsidies and reducing the peso's value will cause a lot of havoc. It could lead to even higher inflation, as energy and transportation costs increase and imports become more expensive. Inflation is already heading towards 200% as a result of money printing by other administrations. And the peso's devaluation also has terrible short-term effects on the country's debt problems. Currently, the government's total sovereign debt exceeds $400 billion, about 2/3 of the nominal GDP. A significant portion of this debt is in dollars, which means that a peso devaluation effectively increases the debt burden. So this shock therapy plan takes some balls, politically, because the immediate effects are not going to be pretty. We could see massive protests from the 44% of Argentinians who voted against Milei. But long-term, this plan could reboot Argentina's economy. When the government stops printing money and using massive amounts of debt, the economy could stabilize. In such a stable environment, companies could thrive and the economy will hopefully develop. If the next administrators follow this path, miracles could happen. The country still has great potential, despite the terrible government policies that have ruined the 20th century. Its demographics are perhaps the most important factor, as it is one of the best in the Western world. Argentina has a steadily growing population, with a fertility rate of 1.9 in 2021. The country still has a very young population, which we can see in its population pyramid. And the region is expected to catch up over the coming decades, as Brazil is estimated to become the world's 5th largest economy by 2050. This can have benefits for South America, Argentina included. If Argentina plays the long game, the country can put an end to its slow demise and get on a growth trajectory once again.